for now, in the summer, all eyes on the Democratic race for president. This week, 10 contenders qualified for September's debate in Houston, Texas. It will be the first time former VP Joe Biden will share the stage with Senator Elizabeth Warren, who's rising in the polls and courting the party establishment. And as others work to improve their standing, 10 others will try to stay in the hunt despite not making the stage. But it's a tough road ahead. This week, New York Senator Kirsten Gillibrand dropped out of the race. All of this comes as the political map is redrawn for 2020, with Georgia looking more and more like a possible battleground. It's now home to 2 Senate races in 2020, following the announcement this week by GOP Senator Johnny Isakson that he will retire at the end of this year due to his health. We wish him the best. When you think, though, about the Iowa caucuses, there was big news on Friday. You have the Democratic National Committee saying we don't want to have virtual caucuses by phone. People should be showing up. They were concerned about the security of that whole process. Will Iowa still stay first?
It appears so. Iowa said they are still going to do a caucus. They are still going to call it a caucus so that New Hampshire, who likes to call themselves the first primary in the nation, doesn't try to skip ahead of them, and it causes a whole thing. So it seems like everyone's on board with Iowa being first and Iowa being a caucus. Now, how do they deal with the fact that the DNC asked Iowa to try to figure out how can you make this thing more inclusive? And they came back with a plan. The DNC doesn't think it's secure enough, which makes sense after what happened in 2016. But there is a real question of, if you can't get there, if you have to work, is the Iowa caucus process representative? And are they going to be able to, in this sort of short amount of time left, figure out a way to make it secure enough so people can figure out other ways to participate? They said they're committed to trying to look into that, but I'm not sure there's enough time to figure that out anymore.
Well, and I think the time is the problem, because presidential campaigns are built around strategies of turnout, and especially at a caucus, how do you, each candidate will have sort of tried to determine for themselves what is their best, path to winning by turning out certain groups, certain amounts of people. Barack Obama, when he was there, tried to vastly expand the number of people who actually turned out to the caucus. That benefited him. But to the extent that the process is scrambled for a long period of time, so the campaigns don't really know what's the universe of people that they're likely to be working with, that's going to make it very difficult for all of the campaigns to figure out.
Well, Bob, if the standard is Iowa inclusive, we can answer the question, no, it's not, any more than New Hampshire is. So
True.
If you start having this discussion, if you're these states, you can't go very far down it, because there's no justification for these unrepresentative small states to have their outsized role, except that they're very intimate, except that an effort by a particular candidacy that otherwise wouldn't get noticed can somehow penetrate in these small states. So I think it puts the whole logic behind these states in kind of a harsh light.
Vivian, inside of the White House, when they look at Vice President Biden struggling this week a bit politically as he responded to a Washington Post report about how he told a war story in his encounter with different U.S. military personnel, they see Senator Warren rising. What's on their radar?
I mean, it's definitely ammo for them. Certainly, I think the one that's really got their attention is Biden still, because of the fact that he's leading the pack. It's just the obvious one as a front runner. But I mean, Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders are on their radar. A couple of others pop up here and there, but for the most part, they're not too worried about them. I think the White House believes that it's too early, but they're watching and they're collecting ammo with every gaffe that happens and every sort of internal dispute that happens between the Democrats. They're watching very closely.
Vice sat down with Senator Bernie Sanders this week. We often hear about Senator Warren and Vice President Biden, Senator Warren, Vice President Biden. What about Senator Sanders? Is he in this race?
He definitely is in this race. I mean, we were in Kentucky and we were in Pennsylvania. He had a big crowd in Kentucky. He got his first union endorsement in Pennsylvania and Pittsburgh, sort of Joe Biden's Scranton backyard. But the interesting thing is Elizabeth Landers, our correspondent, really pushed him on this idea of how do you differentiate yourself between yourself and Elizabeth Warren. And she pushed him over and over again, and he refused to really, one, go after Elizabeth Warren, which I kind of understand, but two, really give us a clear answer of how he is different. And at a certain point, he turned it back on our correspondent and said, hey, that's a media question. No one's asking that. And the thing is, people have asked him that. Like, people in public have asked him that other than the media. But at some point, and this, we'll see if next week's debate is that point, he is going to have to say why his plans are different than hers and what can he articulate that makes him better than her. Now, maybe it might be that all eyes are actually on like what Biden does in between Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. But at some point, who are you in comparison?
And sometimes politics is about not just what you do against another candidate, but how the map changes. You look at Georgia, suddenly a real state for 2020, 2 Senate races. Stacey Abrams, the former state minority leader, said she will not run for Senate. But Georgia, the Atlanta suburbs, perhaps a competitive battleground.
Right, and I think part of that is a reflection of the sort of follow-on effects of the 2016 campaign, which really scrambled the map in a lot of ways that upended the traditional thinking about that. But it's also changing demographics in the country. When I started as a young reporter in Virginia, for example, 25 years ago, it was a solidly red state that Democrats didn't even think of competing in. Now it's I used to call it a purple state. I think it's maybe even solidly blue in some ways, depending on the time. So I mean, I think these things do change, and one of the tests for both political parties is whether they can adapt by finding candidates to run. Stacey Abrams, a big disappointment to the Democrats that apparently she's not going to run. But like, how can you find the candidates to run, and can you mount successful campaigns in a state that you don't have a lot of experience on?
Well, and the Trump campaign is keeping a close eye on this too, and they are really beefing up their political game, their groundwork game in a lot of these states, which are purple, as we say, or whatever you want to call them, just because they believe that that's going to be their key.
Which states are they looking at?
Wisconsin is definitely a big one. You guys help me out. You guys cover the campaigns more than I do.
And Sean Duffy just announced, the congressman from Wisconsin, that he's retiring this week.
Yeah, for sure. So, Michigan is another one. Pennsylvania, obviously, is always a battleground. And so, the Trump campaign is pouring money, resources, and everything else into those states.
What about Senator Gillibrand's exit from the race? Is this the first of a wave to come as it just becomes harder and harder, John, to make the debate stage?
Well, sure, and it's welcome. The good news is we only have one debate to cover.
You mean it's welcome in terms of coverage for reporters?
I think it is certainly for us. And, there's grumbling about the DNC rules, which, they are somewhat arbitrary. But ultimately, voters can't decide among 20 people, and the race has to narrow. And so I welcome it. I mean, but it is going to be one debate night, but it's going to be over 3 hours. It's going to be like watching the Jerry Lewis telethon. Anyway, we're finally seeing some fluidity. Really, you look back over the summer, we haven't seen that much fluidity. A lot has happened, but not a lot has changed. And as summer turns to fall, the structure of the race is changing.
I also just think this, in some ways, this idea that the debate rules were not explained well enough and they're not fair. The thing is, there had to be some kind of rules. There were a lot of candidates. The DNC, I remember interviewing someone at the DNC sort of early on this year, and they were like, we are trying to be incredibly transparent. I remember asking them what was their list of candidates that were officially running, and they wouldn't even give that to me because they didn't want to be seen as putting their thumb on the scale. Everyone's known the rules. A lot of people were on the stages for the first 2 debates. Yes, it's turned into this culling process, but you got to say, if you can't get 2% and you can't get a certain amount of donors,
and look,
you're not competing.
The magic thing about democracy in this country is that you can't plan it out, right? They set up, the Democrats and Republicans do this too, set up a process that they hope will come forward with a certain number of candidates. You end up with Steve Bullock off and Andrew Yang on, and that's the way democracy works.